ago today, the pride of the Royal Australian Navy, the HMAS Sydney, was sunk off the West Australian coast by a German raider, a ship called the Cormoran, in a surprise attack. It was and remains the greatest naval tragedy in the history of our nation. All 645 souls on board the Sydney perished. For 8 long decades, the identity of one of those sailors whose remains washed up on Christmas Island some 11 weeks after the Sydney was sunk, well, their name has been a mystery until now. Associate Editor of the Australian newspaper, Jamie Walker, has written beautifully about this story today. He joins me now from Brisbane. Jamie, who was the unknown sailor?
Well, he was a 21-year-old able seaman from Brisbane, Thomas Clark. He was an accountant. He was from a very well-to-do family, and he'd only joined the Sydney 2.5 months before the ship was attacked by the Cormoran and lost in those very tragic circumstances off Western Australia in 1941.
Tell us about this. It's not an easy thing to have found his identity. We know his remains turned up in a lifeboat on Christmas Island. He was buried as an unknown sailor. We now know who he was. How did that happen?
Oh, it's an incredible story, and it's taken over 15 years for it to get to this point. The remains of the unknown sailor were lost for many, many years. The Japanese invaded Christmas Island just after he was buried there, and all of the burial records and many other records of the island were destroyed during the occupation. So the remains weren't in fact rediscovered until 2006, and it was through the work of a amateur detective, a woman in Western Australia called Glenys Parkinson, and she ensured that she got the Navy interested in it. The remains were found again on Christmas Island. They were reinterred in Geraldton, and at that point, from 2008 onwards, after the wrecks of the Sydney and the Cormoran were rediscovered, a very, very big investigation was started by the Navy, where they took DNA samples from the remains and started trying to match them with the families of the Sydney crew, and eventually they hit pay dirt.
And what was interesting when I was reading the information that the AFP was used as well. I mean, this is wonderful, these agencies come together. And because able seaman Thomas Clark was so tall, it helped, or tall for those ages, he was a 6-footer at the turn of the century, it narrowed down for us the number of people who it could be. How will he be remembered now that we know who he was?
Oh, look, I think he will be remembered as everyone who gave their lives in World War II are remembered, as heroes, as the young men and women who saved this nation. Remember, he really had the world at his feet. He was an accountant. He came from a very good family. He had just, in fact, got engaged when just before he joined the Sydney. And I think it's sort of one of these tragedies which we have no way to understand today because we simply don't have that experience. There virtually wasn't a family in the country that wasn't touched when the Sydney went down. It was followed by the losses of several more ships in the Navy in actions in the Mediterranean and up in the Java Sea, and of course only months later in February 1942. You had Singapore falling, so it's a terribly traumatic time, and we look back at the sacrifices that were made at that time, and you can only be very grateful that there are people in this country who will still honour the memories of those who gave their lives all those years ago.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm sorry I have to leave it there. I commend your column to people today to find out more about the Sydney. I think it's a moment of history we need to understand here in Australia. Thank you for your time.